The fluorescent lights above me buzzed and flickered, and for a moment I thought I was dreaming. I wasn't. The woman in scrubs standing at the foot of my bed was very real, and so was the clipboard she was holding, and so was the number she tapped with her pen. $47,200. Ms. Calloway, she said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. We've been trying to reach your emergency contact since yesterday morning. I already knew they hadn't reached him. Because my husband had turned his phone off, I watched Stuart from the beginning, because if I just tell you the ending, you won't believe me. I barely believe it myself, and I lived it. My name is Claire. I was 31 years old, working as a dental office manager in Cincinnati, Ohio, married for 4 years to a man I thought I knew better than anyone on earth. His name was Marcus. We met at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. I know, the irony. He was charming and steady, and he had this way of making you feel like the most important person in the room. I used to tell my best friend that marrying Marcus felt like finally exhaling after holding your breath your whole life. I should have kept holding. It started with what we thought was a kidney infection. I'd had them before, so I drove myself to the urgent care on a Tuesday evening, fully expecting antibiotics and a copay, but my labs came back wrong. Not just a little wrong. My creatinine levels were elevated in a way that scared the attending physician into admitting me immediately. By that night, I was in the hospital with an IV in my arm, and a nephrologist on call was using words like acute kidney injury and unknown cause, and we need to run more tests. Marcus came that first night. He brought my phone charger and a change of clothes, and he sat beside my bed for 2 hours. He held my hand. He told me everything was going to be fine. What I didn't know then was that he had already started making calls. The tests took 3 days. During those 3 days, Marcus visited once more, briefly, on the second afternoon, claiming he had a mandatory work meeting he couldn't miss. He kissed my forehead. He told me to rest. He said he'd be back in the evening. He wasn't back that evening, or the next morning, or the morning after that. On day 4, a financial counselor named Patricia came to my room. She was a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the practiced calm of someone who delivers bad news for a living. She explained that my insurance had flagged the claim. Marcus had removed me from his employer plan 2 weeks prior. Something about a coverage change during open enrollment, and had not told me. The backup policy I thought we had through my job at the dental office had a $5,000 deductible and a cap on specialist care that this hospitalization had already blown through. The bill, at that point, was sitting at $31,000 and climbing. Patricia handed me a pamphlet about hospital financial assistance programs. I stared at it without reading a single word. I called Marcus 12 times that afternoon. The first 4 rang through to voicemail. After that, they went straight to voicemail, which means he saw my name and declined the call. I know the difference. Anyone who has been ghosted by someone who is supposed to love them knows the difference. My best friend Danny came and sat with me that evening. She didn't say much. She just pulled her chair close to my bed and held my hand the same way Marcus had, except she actually meant it. I cried for about an hour and then I stopped, because crying was making my blood pressure spike and my nurse kept coming in with a look on her face that made me feel guilty. By day 6, the hospital's case management team had gotten involved. They were not cruel about it, but they were clear. My current insurance situation created complications for continued inpatient care. They were referring me to a financial advocate and exploring options, but I needed to understand the reality of what I was looking at. That night, I lay there in the dark listening to the sounds of the ward. The beeping, the distant murmur of nurses at the station, someone down the hall coughing. And I thought about how 4 years of marriage had dissolved so quietly that I hadn't even heard it happen. The next morning, a man I had never seen before walked into my room. He was older, maybe mid-60s, wearing a gray suit that fit him the way expensive suits do, like it was made for him, not bought off a rack. His hair was silver. He walked in slowly, like he wasn't sure of his welcome, and he stopped at the foot of my bed and just looked at me for a moment without speaking. I thought he had the wrong room. "Are you Claire?" he asked. His voice was steady, but there was something around the edges of it. "Yes," I said. "Who are you?" He didn't answer right away. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out an envelope, then set it on the tray table beside my water cup. "Your bill has been taken care of," he said. "All of it. You don't need to worry about that anymore." I stared at him. "I'm sorry. What? Who are you?" He pulled the chair from the corner of the room, the visitor's chair that Danny had been sitting in the night before, and he sat down in it like he had all the time in the world. Then he folded his hands in his lap and he said, "My name is Robert Calloway, and I think I'm your father." The room went very quiet. Or maybe that was just inside my head. I was adopted. I had always known that in the way you know something that has been part of your whole life, stated plainly, never hidden. Just a fact, like any other fact. My adoptive parents were good people. They passed away within 2 years of each other when I was in my mid-20s, and I had grieved them fully and honestly. I had never searched for my biological family. It had never searched for my biological family. It had never felt urgent. I had enough to carry without opening that door. But here was that door, walking into my hospital room in a gray suit, telling me he had paid $47,200 of medical bills I had no way to cover. "Why?" I said. It was the only word I could find. He looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were brown, the same shade as mine. I noticed that before I wanted to notice it. "Because I've known where you were for 11 years, he said. "And I have been a coward for every single one of them. And when I found out you were here, I decided I was not going to be a coward anymore. I want to tell you that I had some graceful reaction, that I said something wise or asked the right questions or held myself together with dignity. I didn't. I pressed the call button for my nurse and asked her to please come to the room. And when she came in, I asked her to verify whether my bill had actually been paid, because a stranger was sitting in my room claiming it was, and I needed to know if any of this was real. It was real. Patricia, the financial counselor, confirmed it within 20 minutes. Paid in full by wire transfer that morning. Robert. I couldn't call him anything else yet. I wasn't ready for any other word. Came back the next afternoon. I had asked him to give me a day to think. He respected that without question, which, I noted, was more than Marcus had ever done with a single request I made. He brought documents the second visit. Not to pressure me. He was careful to say that, and I believed him. He brought them because he said he thought I deserved to see the full picture before I decided anything. My biological mother had been his college girlfriend. She had gotten pregnant their senior year. He had panicked, his word, and he said it without excusing himself, and she had made the decision to place me for adoption rather than raise me alone. She had passed away from cancer 7 years ago. He had found out about me 3 years after that through her sister, my biological aunt, who had kept a box of letters and photographs and had finally decided after his wife of 30 years died that he deserved to know. He had hired a private investigator. He had found me within 4 months. He had then spent 11 years arguing with himself about whether reaching out would disrupt my life more than it would help it. "I watched from a distance," he said, and he didn't look proud of it. "I knew you worked in healthcare administration. I knew you got married. I told myself you were fine. You had a life. What right did I have to walk into it? And now," I said, "now you were lying in a hospital bed with no one paying your bills and a husband who had disappeared," he said quietly, and I decided I had already waited long enough. My nephrologist came in that afternoon with new results. That's when everything shifted again, because this story wasn't just about Marcus leaving and a stranger arriving. There was a third thing, and it was the one that unraveled everything. The new labs, combined with the 24-hour urine test they had run earlier in the week, had flagged something that the kidney specialist wanted to discuss: the pattern of my toxicity levels. The specific compounds, the distribution, was not consistent with infection or with genetic disease or with any of the several other explanations they had been testing against. It was consistent with long-term, low-dose exposure to a heavy metal compound. The doctor used careful language. She said they were not making any determinations. She said they would need to do further testing. She said she wanted to refer me to a toxicologist. I sat very still while she talked, and then after she left, I thought about the supplements. 8 months earlier, Marcus had started being attentive, I suppose, is the word I would have used then. He had read an article about kidney health, he said, and wanted to make sure we were both taking care of ourselves. He had ordered a set of supplements online, herbal blends, and he had started putting them on the kitchen counter every morning next to my coffee cup. He was so consistent about it. I had been touched by it. I had taken them every day without a second thought because he was my husband and I trusted him. He had removed me from his insurance 2 weeks before I was hospitalized. His phone had been off since the morning of day 2. I called Danny and I told her what the doctor had said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Claire, where are those supplements now?" They were at home. In the kitchen cabinet, above the coffee maker. Danny went to my apartment that evening with a spare key and brought the bottles to the hospital. I gave them to my doctor. She sent them to the lab. I don't want to compress this into something neater than it was, because living through it was not neat. There were 2 more weeks in the hospital while they treated my kidneys and waited for results. There were days I felt better, and days I felt like I was dissolving. Robert came back every day. He didn't push conversation. He would sit and read or bring coffee for Danny, or just be present in a way that I was surprised to find I didn't resent. I was too tired to be complicated about it. He was there. That counted for something. Danny researched Marcus while I was recovering. She is a paralegal and she is formidably good at finding things, and what she found was, I don't have a clean word for it. He had a second bank account. He had been moving money into it for at least 18 months, small amounts at first and then larger ones. There was a woman he had been seeing for almost 2 years, someone he had worked with before he changed jobs. And there was a life insurance policy on me, standard enough, except that he had increased the benefit amount 8 months ago. 8 months ago, the same time the supplements started. The lab results came back 10 days after I was admitted. The bottles contained elevated levels of aristolochic acid, a compound found in certain herbal plants that is a known nephrotoxin. It is not a common supplement ingredient. It had to be sourced and added deliberately. The concentrations in the capsules were not what you would find in any legitimate product. My doctor contacted the hospital's legal team. The hospital contacted the police. I gave a statement from my bet. Marcus was picked up at the apartment he had been renting, the one I had not known existed, in a neighborhood 20 minutes from where we lived 4 days later. He had not, it turned out, run far. He had just assumed I would die before anyone started asking questions. I was in the hospital for 19 days total. By the time I was discharged, my kidneys were functioning at acceptable levels and would likely recover fully over the following months with monitoring and care. I walked out of that hospital on a Tuesday morning in October with Danny on one side of me and Robert on the other, and the strangest feeling in my chest. Something that was not quite relief and not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but some compound of all 3 that I did not have a name for. The recovery was slow. I want to be honest about that because I have seen how these stories get told, how the hard part gets summarized in a sentence and then the triumphant part gets all the space. The hard part took months. There were weeks when I slept 12 hours a day and still felt exhausted. There were nights I woke up at 2 in the morning and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how I had loved a person who had been methodically poisoning me while I thanked him for being thoughtful. That is not a thing you process quickly. I saw a therapist twice a week and I let myself be honest in those sessions in a way I had not been honest with anyone, including myself, in a long time. Robert and I moved slowly too. He did not try to collapse 4 decades of absence into a few dinners. He was patient in a way that I think he had earned through years of knowing he had no right to rush anything. We talked on the phone. We had coffee. He told me about his life. He ran a regional logistics company, had 2 adult sons from his marriage, lived in Columbus. My half-brothers. That was strange to say. I said it out loud once at a coffee shop, and then I had to stare out the window for a minute before I could continue the conversation. He had already amended his estate planning, he told me, several months before I ended up in the hospital, when he had finally admitted to himself that the waiting had gone on long enough. He had included me. Not out of obligation, he said, and not to buy anything. Because I was his daughter and he had already lost too many years pretending otherwise. I did not take that lightly. I also did not take it as the point of any of this, because it wasn't. The money was not the story. The story was that I had been left alone in a hospital bed by someone who promised to love me, and a stranger had walked in and chosen me, and somewhere in the intersection of those two things, I had found out that the version of my life I thought I was living was not the real one. Marcus was charged with first-degree attempted murder, along with insurance fraud and financial crimes related to the account draining. His trial date was set for the following spring. I gave my victim impact statement at the preliminary hearing, and I kept my voice level the entire time, not because I wasn't feeling anything, but because I had decided that the steadiest thing I could do was refuse to perform distress for him. He sat across the room and looked at the table, and I looked at the prosecutor and I said everything I needed to say. The afternoon after the hearing, Robert took Danny and me to dinner. It was not a celebration exactly. It didn't feel right to call it that. It was more like a closing and also an opening. We sat at a corner table and ate and talked about ordinary things. And at one point, Robert's older son called him, and Robert put him on speaker briefly and introduced me, somewhat awkwardly, as my daughter, Claire, and there was a pause on the other end of the line. Then his son said, "We've been wondering when you were going to do that." Apparently they had known. Robert had told them before he came to the hospital. He had asked their permission, in a way, or at least their understanding. They had given it. I thought about that a lot afterward, that there had been a whole family in Columbus who knew I existed and had been waiting to meet me. The thought made me feel something I hadn't expected to feel. Not longing, exactly. More like relief. Like a thing that had been unaccounted for in the inventory of my life had finally been found. I still live in Cincinnati. I still work in healthcare administration. Although I changed offices, I needed a new start in that way too. I have appointments with my nephrologist every 3 months, and the numbers keep improving. I talk to Robert every few days. I met his sons over a long weekend in November, my half-brothers, whose names I say without flinching now, and it was awkward and warm in equal measure, and we are all figuring out what we are to each other, which feels honest. I think about the version of myself who was lying in that hospital bed in September, watching the financial counselor tap a number on a clipboard, with a husband who had turned his phone off. I think about how alone that felt. And I think about the fact that I was never actually alone, that there was a man in Columbus who had known where I was for 11 years and had finally run out of excuses to stay away. He told me much later that when he walked into my room that first morning, he almost turned around in the doorway. He stood there and looked at me and thought, "She has her mother's eyes, and I have wasted so much time." He didn't turn around. Some people come back too late to matter. He came back just in time, and I have decided, deliberately and with full knowledge of everything it requires, to let that be enough to start with. I keep coming back to one moment. Not the courtroom, not the lab results, not even the morning Robert walked through that door. I keep coming back to the Tuesday I drove myself to urgent care thinking I had a kidney infection, parked my own car, checked myself in, and texted Marcus that I was there, and he replied, "Oh, keep me posted," and I thought that was normal. I had gotten so used to being alone inside my marriage that I had stopped noticing it. That is what I think about when I think about how any of this was allowed to happen for as long as it did. Marcus did not become someone who would poison his wife overnight. And I did not become someone who would miss the signs overnight either. It happened in increments, the way most quiet damage does. A boundary moved here, a question swallowed there. A red flag explained away until explaining things away became automatic. I was not stupid. I wasn't, though clearly, because I spent a long time after everything came out wondering how I could have been so blind. But intelligence isn't the same as clarity when you're inside something. Clarity requires distance. I didn't have distance. I had a marriage I was trying to hold together, and a husband who was very good at seeming like the kind of man who deserved the benefit of the doubt. What I understand now is that there are three things that either hold you together or let you down in a moment of real crisis. And all three of them had been quietly tested in me without my knowing it. The first is character, not what you claim to value, but what you actually do when it costs you something. Robert had spent 11 years failing that test. He knew I existed, he knew where I was, and he kept choosing the easier thing, which was to stay away and tell himself it was for my benefit. Until one day, he didn't. He showed up. He paid a bill he didn't owe. He sat in that visitor's chair and told me the truth without softening it to make himself look better. That is not a small thing. Character is not fixed. It can be rebuilt, but it is rebuilt through actions, not intentions, and Robert understood that, which is why he brought documents instead of excuses. The second is the discipline to think clearly when your emotions are loudest. When Patricia handed me that pamphlet in the hospital, every instinct I had was to collapse, and I almost did. But somewhere underneath the shock, there was a part of me that kept asking questions. Where is Marcus? Why is the insurance wrong? What exactly is in these supplements? What do the numbers actually mean? That part of me saved my life. Not literally in the medical sense. The doctors did that. But in the sense that I did not accept the story I was being handed. I kept pulling at the thread. Danny did too. We were not passive about our own survival, and that mattered. The third is simply the willingness to keep going when you have every reason not to. 19 days in a hospital bed, months of fatigue, a trial to prepare for, a marriage to grieve, a stranger to figure out how to trust. There is no version of recovering from what happened to me that didn't require waking up every day and choosing to engage with it rather than disappear from it. I won't pretend that was easy or that I managed it gracefully, but I did it, and the doing of it, imperfect, exhausting, unglamorous, is the only reason I'm on the other side of it now. Marcus made his choices. They caught up with him in the way that choices like that always eventually do. Not because of fate or some cosmic balancing force, but because deception on that scale requires maintaining too many lies at once, and the math eventually stops working. The supplements, the insurance, the second account, the other woman, the policy. Each one was a loose thread. Eventually, Danny pulled one, and they all came undone. I did not come out of this without damage. But I came out of it knowing who I am in a way I didn't before. That is not nothing. That is, I think, everything.